I saw the dress on my sister's feed and something inside me unclipped. It was a small, ordinary thing, and yet it felt like a verdict. They had built an entire life without me, and then invited the world to watch the reveal. No call, no note, no slow check if I'd seen it. Nothing. Just a polished image of forever that excluded me by design. Restoring old homes has been my trade. Give me a rotten stair, and I will make it honest again. Give me a broken window, and I will set it so the light falls the way it used to. That is how I learned the vocabulary of repair. I am good at fixing things other people give up on. For a long time, that felt like belonging. I called my mother. She did not say we had planned the wedding without you. She said Nyla was sensitive. She said things that, to her, explained away exclusion. I listened to the texture of her voice, practiced at masking disappointment. It is a weird skill, pretending you are not rearranging your insides. I think, maybe, I had been doing that for them my whole life. They have stories about me. Responsible one, reliable, the one who co-signed loans and took midnight calls and showed up without question. Those stories were true. They were also used like a ledger. You put in effort. You are expected to balance accounts. You are expected to take the weight and never complain. At first, I wanted to be seen. I wanted a chance to explain, to ask why a single invitation could be lost by so many people who had my number. Then I felt the cold shift from wanting to be seen to wanting to be noticed in a way that made them uncomfortable. I sat with that switch for 3 days. I watched them celebrate through others' feeds. They posed. They smiled. They shared cake tastings and bridesmaids and venue shots. I was a blank space in each frame. The more I watched, the more I cataloged. Names of cousins who had not texted me in years. Comments from people who strapped themselves to the spectacle as if it were their duty. A family portrait where my absence was a hole they knew how to fill without asking why. There was a comedy of omission to it. I drove to my parents' house because the war of omission felt like an open wound, and confrontation is a primitive, clarifying thing. The house sat the way it always had, a Victorian that held its history like pearl. When I pulled in the gravel, I noticed Dad in the garage, his hands stained with oil. He looked at me and then away. He did not move to sweep me into the hall with that little triumphant smile men sometimes use to show everything is normal. Mom was inside, orchestrating the wedding logistics with the comfortable ruthlessness of someone who runs a household like a business. Their explanations were a practiced play. We know how this goes. They had their lines. I stayed on stage and let them speak. I let them believe their performance would soothe me. That is part of being the fixer, too. You create a quiet where others can live. But there was another quality rising in me, a planning mind that had been tempered by years of meticulous work. When you restore a house, you learn to see structure under rot. You learn what will hold against time and what will crumble under pressure. Relationships are not so different if you pay attention. You learn the hidden load-bearing walls. You learn where the termites are. Maybe that is what settled my anger into something slow and precise. I decided then, without a grand speech, to stop playing their role. Not with a tantrum, not with small passive aggression. I decided on a method. I wanted the kind of revenge that fits the contours of the betrayal. It had to be precise and dark, and, to be honest, it had to feel like restoration, because I had never been content with chaos for its own sake. I wanted to rebuild the ledger so it reflected what had actually been given and taken. The first thing I did was go quiet. I removed myself from the visible circuits they used to ignore me. I deleted their names from my contact lists, as if plucking weeds from a garden. It felt petty at first. It felt righteous later. I did not post about it. Then I listened, not because I expected apologies, not because I thought silence would soften them. I listened to where they talked about the wedding, who they trusted, which vendors they used. I let their confidence be my map. They bragged about the venue, about a friend of a friend who did catering, about a planner who knew exactly how to keep things seamless. That is how the world builds itself, through networks, favors, borrowed reputations. I began to write those networks down. I started small. I called people who were peripheral to their plans, and to my advantage, unaware that I had been erased. Neighbors, an old classmate who runs a wedding magazine, a barista who had helped with a cake tasting. I asked questions that felt casual and curious. What dates are you holding? Who is coordinating the caterer? Who is responsible for seating? I learned names. I learned which contracts were signed and which were still in negotiation. I spent slow evenings in public records and business sites, not to commit crimes, but to verify claims. Registrations, permit filings, deposit signatures. The kind of things families do not think to hide because they are not doing anything illegal. They are simply building with the confidence that the people they love are around. That assumption can be exploited. I hired a few small favors in the form of research I paid for. Nothing drastic. A private investigator would have been over the top and also messy. Instead, I fed small sums to people who owed favors. A journalist I once helped with a story came through with a respectful lookup. A contractor I had worked with for years gave me a list of vendors and the payment schedules. I whispered my motive. I wanted to understand how the wedding stood together, like someone admiring scaffolding. Then I began to move the social pieces, again, not violently, not criminally. I created cracks. I planted doubt. In family affairs, people mostly need permission to worry. A rumor is a tiny virus. It needs a host. I did not invent facts, but I highlighted ones they had not wanted brought into the light. Old debts, small betrayals, things that sit like grit in an otherwise polished invitation. I emailed, under a neutral account, a few well-placed notes to vendors about certain liabilities in the contract. I called a venue and asked an innocuous question that made them check their calendar twice. I let vendors believe there were scheduling conflicts and legal wrinkles. I did not lie. I asked questions. The rest, the universe filled in with its own bureaucracy. Contracts creaked. Deposits were rechecked. The small mechanical failures that are part of every big wedding started to show signs of strain. At the same time, I let gossip bloom. I sent a casual message to Jenna, a friend who had always been sympathetic, telling her something that made her look twice at a friend's Instagram comment. I didn't say much. The point was to create reflection, not a headline. Reflection in small social circles is like a slow drip that weakens mortar. People start to take things seriously when they hear someone else take them seriously. There was one move that surprised me. I reached out to Nyla's ex, the one who had left and forced her back home years ago. He owed me nothing. He had been messy. But so had she. I offered him an odd courtesy, a clearing of accounts if he agreed to a conversation with certain cousins. I framed it as closure. He came because men like him often want to be part of something where they can show their growth. He had a story that complicated the one Nyla was telling. I listened to it with a craftsman's attentive ear. His truth was messy. It did not need embellishment to sting. I collected these truths, and I let them cool. You must understand, I did not want chaos. I wanted proportion. I wanted their sense of security to wobble in a way that matched how they had treated me. For years, I had shown up, and they assumed I would always be a prop in the background. I did not want them to have that easy assumption anymore. The strangest part was feeling no immediate surge of triumph when the first small crack appeared. The caterer called and said there might be a double booking. A cousin texted, asking if I was even being invited. Mom called in panic and blamed logistics. I listened to that panic and counted it like a scaffold that had been loosened. There was a quietness now when they spoke about the wedding as a monolith. They paused. They checked. It was a minor victory, and already sweeter than I expected. But my methods also made me new in ways I did not plan. I found myself enjoying the architecture of manipulation, the craft of careful unmasking. It felt dangerous and strangely honest. This was not the madness of someone who wanted to burn a house down. It was the intent of someone who wanted the foundation inspected so the family could rebuild on truth if they wanted to. Maybe that makes me a hypocrite. Maybe it makes me a necessary cruelty. I am not sure what the moral line is when your generosity has been taken as a license to exclude you. For the first time in years, I imagined a Saturday that belonged to me without obligation. The revenge became a map to freedom as much as it was a ledger to proof. I could have acted sooner. I could have shouted, demanded inclusion, created a scene. But those are amateur moves. This was patient. This was surgical. And it felt like justice in slow motion. I watched them move through their days with a slightly reduced confidence. I watched them reallocate time to make sure this wedding would not collapse. They found new vendors. They double-checked lines. They paid extra for reassurance. The cost was on them, which in itself felt like a ledger finally balancing. On the morning I planned to test the final piece of my strategy, I stood in the shadow of my own making and felt something like pity. There was fallout. A cousin called and asked me, in a voice I did not recognize, why I would do this. A vendor demanded confirmation. Nyla sent a message that read like paper. There was anger and confusion. My phone lit up in ways that made my chest tighten. I closed it and walked out into the pale sunlight, trying to remember the difference between being responsible and being erased. In the weeks that followed, they tightened. They became more deliberate. The wedding did not collapse outright. It shifted. They apologized in ways that sounded like routine. They replaced vendors. They patched. They preserved the performance of peace. But I was no longer a background player who kept their set in order. I had decided to be a visible presence in their narrative. It was not a kind choice. It was a necessary one. I was not finished. Revenge, for me, had never been about spectacle. It was about changing the conditions under which people made choices. The second phase was to reframe the narrative publicly, but without melodrama. I began writing. Not angry posts, not long open letters. I wrote precise, clear messages that landed where rumors become facts. I sent a concise email to the wedding planner, not accusing but direct. Could you confirm that all vendor deposits were received and documented? Could we verify the guest list? The planner replied with corporate polish, but the seed had been planted. My questions made them re-examine what they had been glossing over. I had not intended to inflict cruelty that broke people. I wanted discomfort that matched what they had given me, an inconvenience proportional to years of being invisible. One of them called my office, breathless and apologetic. I let him speak. His apology smelled of grease and old habits. He said, "Please, come to the house." It sounded like bargaining. I went. Not to take part, but to show that my presence could not be wished away. They expected either fury or a plea. I delivered neither. I stood where I always had, quiet and solid. My father tried to steer the conversation toward reconciliation. Mom deployed that particular kindness that is mostly an armor. Nyla avoided my eyes. But the tension was different now. It was awkward because it could not be performed away. Then came the delicious, ugly business of consequence. A vendor who had once trusted their word called and said he needed signatures. He asked for paper trail. The cousin, who had been instrumental in smoothing things over before, suddenly admitted she had not actually paid the band. The band was in fact double booked. The caterer had been promised a deposit that had not cleared. The planner, trying to be conciliatory, confessed she had not insisted on written confirmations for the smaller vendors because of the family status. She used the word family like a spell that once made things easier. That confession was the hinge. I did not gloat. I reported it coldly to those whose trust they had meant to trust. I told the venue about the double booking. I told the caterer to confirm deposits. I told the band to check the calendar. I did not lie. I merely invited attention. Attention has a way of turning inertia into action. People started blaming each other. Fingers pointed in small circles. The family, which had once been a single organism, fragmented into teams. Some wanted to keep the wedding on schedule and threw money at the problem. Others wanted to postpone and salvage reputations. Nyla, who had been wrapped in satin and sunlight, began to look less luminous in photographs. I collected a few stories from people who had seen what I had always done. Times I took a stranger in. Moments I fixed broken things for others without being asked. The night I stayed with the family when the water heater burst and they had a baby. These were simple, human acts. I recorded them and kept them like tools. I did not release them as an accusation. I used them as context. I wrote a short essay in a local paper about belonging and the labor of care. The piece did not name names. It described a kind of person who always shows up and the loneliness that follows when that service is expected rather than welcomed. It was not petty, it was careful. The essay circulated like a warm current. Someone in the family read it aloud at a gathering, assuming the piece was abstract. It landed like a mirror. People began to talk differently about me. Some of the commentary stung, that I was making trouble, that my withdrawal was selfish. Others, often quieter and less visible, sent messages that said things like, "I always thought you did too much." The public shift did what planning and vendor failure had done. It forced perspective. For them, the ledger had been rewritten in a way they could not control by ignoring. Then, the more delicate move. There are things families keep to themselves because they consider them shameful. I had discovered one such scene in the weeks of my quiet inquiry. It was not criminal. It was the kind of mismanaged accounting that happens when people are comfortable being careless with each other's trust. A loan had been repurposed. A deposit had been double counted. It was bureaucratic and petty and very human. I let these details circulate in private circles where gossip takes the shape of moral concern. The aim was not to humiliate, but to force them to account for the ways they had used each other. When the truth of the loan came out, not as accusation, but as fact, faces paled. The family that had assumed a certain level of mutual indebtedness found that their debts were not as they had believed. The wedding shifted to a later date. Guests adjusted. The family paid more than they intended. They apologized in forms that sounded like payments. At the rehearsal, the MC, who had been a friend of the family, made a clumsy joke that assumed I would be the person to help set up. I spoke as one might at a memorial, calmly and plainly. Some faces flushed. Some eyes dropped. After I finished, a cousin approached and hugged me with a new awkward tenderness. Mom came close and touched my arm with a hand that trembled. Nyla stood near the doorway and watched. There was apology and also resistance. She said I had made the day about me. I said I had made the day honest. In the end, the wedding happened. It was imperfect. It had been delayed and patched and paid for at extra cost. The family smiled and danced. They took photographs where I was included because there was no longer a plausible way to exclude me. My victory was small and statutory. I had not wrecked them. I had not burned bridges for sport. I had forced them to account, to feel, to spend in ways they had not before. I had withdrawn my labor and let them see its value. The revenge changed me. I am not kinder because of it. I am less naive. I learned that setting boundaries is a kind of construction work. It requires tools and skill and the willingness to accept that the thing you are fixing may not be fixed in the way you expect. Some relatives never spoke to me again. Others made tentative moves to reconcile. In the months that followed, I returned to my work with a quieter hand. Houses still needed restoring. People still needed mending.